She wasn't supposed to open the book. But when she did, the photo fluttered out like a ghost with perfect timing. The book smelled like old paper and peppermint. Ruth didn't mean to open it. It just sat there on the tray beside her grandmother's hospital bed, resting under the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft rhythm of Clara's post-stroke sleep. The familiar cover To Kill a Mockingbird, a worn, dog-eared copy, had always been on Clara Belle Simmons' nightstand since Ruth was a child. She picked it up absent-mindedly, letting her fingers drift across the creased spine, then flipped it open. The photo fell out like a feather. Slow. Gentle. But it landed with a thud in Ruth's chest. It was black and white, slightly curled with age. Two teenage girls stood laughing under a tree, caught mid-laughter, arms locked. One was clearly Clara, younger, radiant, in a collared dress and saddle shoes. The other girl was white, with light hair tied back and a book in her hand. Behind them, a strange building loomed, brick walls, tall windows, no name. Ruth flipped the photo. On the back, scribbled in fading black ink, was a strange symbol, not a word, not a signature. Just a mark. A jagged, looping figure, almost like someone had tried to draw an infinity sign through broken glass. Ruth's brows pinched together. Gran? Clara stirred. She blinked awake, pupils slowly focusing. When she saw what Ruth held in her hand, her body jerked so suddenly the heart monitor beeped in protest. No. She croaked. Put that away. Who is she? Ruth asked. Is this you? Clara turned her face to the wall. Her voice dropped, paper thin. I told your mama to burn that thing. But why? Silence. Gran? Still nothing. Just a shiver in her shoulder. Ruth hesitated, then carefully placed the photo back on the tray. Clara's hand twitched, reaching ever so slightly for it, before falling still again. That night, Ruth lay wide-eyed in Clara's brownstone, the one that hadn't changed since the late 70s. It creaked with age, every wall lined with books and plastic-covered furniture that still smelled faintly of cocoa butter and lemon polish. The photo was on the coffee table. It called to her. She scanned the front. The smiles were too real to fake. The two girls weren't posing, they were alive in the frame, caught mid-story. Ruth flipped the photo over again. The symbol stared back. She snapped a picture and ran it through a reverse image search. Nothing. She tried every AI filter, every glyph analyzer she had access to as a reporter. Still nothing. Just a vague resemblance to a cipher, something you'd expect in a spy film or cult. Then she focused on the building behind them. She enhanced it digitally, cropped it, searched for structural matches. Old civil defense shelters. One, maybe, in southern Alabama? Something about it prickled the back of her mind like a place from one of Clara's bedtime stories when she was little. But she could never remember how those stories ended. The next morning, Ruth sat with her mother in the kitchen, steam rising from untouched coffee. I found a photo. Ruth said flatly. Gran and another girl. A white girl. Her mother, Elaine, stiffened. And? Do you know who she is? No. Probably a school friend. Gran looked terrified when she saw it. Elaine sipped her coffee without meeting Ruth's eyes. Your grandmother went through things. Things you don't ask about. I'm not a kid anymore. I'm a journalist. This could be something. Elaine looked at her now. Hard. She kept that photo hidden for a reason. Some ghosts, Ruthie. They don't want to be dug up. But what if they're not ghosts? Ruth said. What if they're wounds that never healed? Her mother said nothing. That evening, Ruth sat beside Clara again. She gently laid the photo in her grandmother's lap. Clara's hands trembled as they hovered above it, not touching it, just hovering, as if it were a flame. Please? Ruth said. Who is she? Clara swallowed hard. Eleanor. The name barely passed her lips. Eleanor who? Another pause. She was my friend. What happened to her? Clara's face crumpled for a second, just enough to show a fracture. She screamed my name. She whispered, almost inaudibly. That's the last thing I remember. Her hand slid the photo away. Her eyes closed. And she turned again toward the window, as if even after 70 years, the truth still waited out there in the dark. Later that night, Ruth turned the photo over one more time and ran it under her phone's UV light. The symbol glowed faintly, but below it, nearly invisible to the naked eye, another line of faded ink emerged. Eleanor, July 15, 1955. Ruth whispered the name. And something deep in her blood said, this wasn't just a memory. It was a secret someone tried very hard to erase. One name. One date. One symbol. But behind it all a scream, still echoing 70 years later. We weren't supposed to be friends. And we sure weren't supposed to be seen together. July 1955. Montgomery County, Alabama. They met behind the bookmobile on a Tuesday. The air buzzed with cicadas and something heavier, something always hanging in the southern summer heat that wasn't just sweat. It was the feeling that eyes were always watching, even where there weren't windows. Clara Belle Simmons, 15, dark-skinned and sharp-eyed, leaned against the back of the dusty van, flipping through Little Women with a knowing smirk. She wasn't supposed to be there, not at that time of day, not in that part of town. But she waited anyway. And just like every Tuesday that summer, Eleanor Whitmore came anyway. Eleanor had the kind of smile that didn't look like it belonged in Montgomery. It was too free. She skipped instead of walked, twirled her skirt like a movie star, and talked like she believed people were mostly good. Even white people. Got something new? Eleanor whispered, sliding a book out of her bag. Fahrenheit 451. It's not even out yet at the library. Clara's eyes widened. You stole it? Borrowed. Eleanor grinned. From my daddy's shelf. He won't notice. They sat in the shade behind the van, knees almost touching, books open across their laps. No one knew about these Tuesday meetings. Not Clara's stern mother, who taught her to never talk to white folks unless she wanted trouble. Not Eleanor's family, whose estate sat 5 miles out, past the pecan trees, where black girls like Clara were never invited. That day, Eleanor brought her mother's camera too. Let's take a photo, she said. Clara froze. What? Why? So we remember. Someday we'll be old and boring, and we'll need proof we weren't always. We can't. We will. Eleanor's voice was firm for once. Just once? The photo was taken with a timer, propped up on a milk crate. They stood in front of the town's old civil defense shelter, half buried and forgotten behind overgrown weeds. Eleanor said she liked how it looked. Like the world was hiding. Clara thought that was foolish, but also true. They laughed too loud for a moment, caught in the sound of their own disobedience. Then the camera clicked. The picture was born. Later that evening, Clara sat on her front porch, the picture pressed tight to her chest. She wasn't sure why her throat felt tight, or why the moment felt like it had been sealed in glass the moment it happened. She had never had a white friend before. She had never thought it possible. Eleanor wasn't like the others. She never flinched when their hands brushed. She never looked around to make sure no one saw. Sometimes Clara wondered if Eleanor even realized the danger. Maybe rich girls didn't feel it. Or maybe they were just better at pretending. 3 days later, Eleanor didn't show up. Not behind the bookmobile. Not at the shelter. Not anywhere. Clara waited under the same tree every afternoon that week, book in hand, like a fool. The picture burned in her pocket. She thought maybe Eleanor was sick. Or grounded. Or maybe her daddy had found the camera and realized what she'd done. But Eleanor never came back. Then the whispers started. Clara overheard them in church, in the grocery line, even among the housekeepers who worked for the Whitmores. White girl gone. No note. No struggle. No signs. Some said Eleanor had run off with a boy. Others said she'd fallen in the river. But the story that stuck like burrs in Clara's mind came from her uncle, muttered low after a swig of whiskey. Sometimes white folks disappear on purpose. Sometimes they're made to. Clara told no one about the photo. Not even her mother. She buried it in the back of To Kill a Mockingbird and tucked the book under her bed. The photo became a ghost one she kept locked away, even as she moved to New York, even as she married, even after everyone from that town pretended Eleanor had never existed. She had tried to forget, but the picture wouldn't let her. 2 weeks after Eleanor vanished, Clara was walking home alone when a truck rolled up beside her slowly, silently. In the back were 3 men she didn't know, except one of them had Eleanor's red ribbon wrapped around his wrist. They didn't say a word. Just watched her. And then the truck drove away. Some wounds are passed down like recipes, quietly, stubbornly. Brooklyn, 2025. Rain pattered lightly against the windows as Ruth sat cross-legged on the floor of Clara's den, surrounded by old photo albums, clippings, and dusty, unopened boxes. She had told herself she wasn't going to get pulled in. She lied. The photo lay next to her laptop. She'd scanned it 5 times, enhanced it with every filter, even dropped it into obscure image boards hoping someone would recognize the symbol on the back. Nothing. Not a whisper. But something about the building in the background gnawed at her. She'd used her journalist credentials to request access to archived architectural maps from the 50s. Several hours and 3 pots of coffee later, she found something. A municipal record. A civil defense shelter built in 1952 just outside Montgomery, Alabama. No longer in operation. Torn down in the 1980s. Exactly where the photo was taken. Ruth leaned back and exhaled sharply. Her grandmother had told her bedtime stories of Alabama, sure. But never about this. Never about any girl named Eleanor. Never about anything that made Clara tremble like she had in that hospital room. She called her mother again. "You remember Gran's friend? Eleanor?" Ruth asked. Long pause. "I told you to leave that be. Why does her name make you sound like you're reading from a closed book?" Elaine's voice dropped. "Because it is closed. And it's not yours to open." That night, Ruth found herself drawn to the attic Clara's. No-go zone. The air up there was thick, dry with insulation dust, the smell of cedar and thyme. She opened a battered trunk marked 1950S, expecting doilies and maybe a wedding dress. What she found instead was a cracked wooden jewelry box. Inside, dried rose petals, a rusted locket, a pressed corsage. And under it all, a folded newspaper clipping, so fragile she had to lift it with both hands. The headline read, "Local girl missing, no signs of foul play." July 18, 1955. The photo of the girl was unmistakable. Eleanor. Slightly younger than in Clara's photo. Same smile, same ribbon in her hair. But her last name? Eleanor Grace Whitmore. Ruth sat back, goosebumps rising. A name. A face. A town. And her grandmother had said nothing for 70 years. She dug deeper. The article was vague, like the paper didn't want to ask hard questions. Disappeared from family estate after breakfast. No break-in. No note. Family believes she ran away. Authorities declined further comment. Ruth narrowed her eyes. No search party. No calls for help. No reward. That wasn't normal for a wealthy white girl in 1955 Alabama. Something was off. The next morning, Ruth returned to the hospital with the article printed out. She waited until Clara's nurse left, then placed the clipping on her lap wordlessly. Clara stared at it for a long time. Her face unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke. "They didn't look for her. Not really. Why not? Because they knew where she went. Where? Clara looked away. Nowhere. Everywhere. Under. Gran. I heard them whisper it. One of them said she got what she deserved. Her voice cracked. 15 years old. Like she was trash. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. You loved her, didn't you? Clara's hands clenched. Not in rage. In grief. I didn't even know what the word meant yet. That night, Ruth lay awake again. She couldn't shake the image of Eleanor's smile or Clara's broken whisper. 15 years old. She opened her laptop and clicked open her notes. This wasn't just a story. This was history that had been gagged. Somewhere in Alabama, there was still blood on the soil. Someone had buried the truth and walked away. But not for much longer. Ruth received an email alert. Her facial recognition scan on Eleanor's photo had pinged. One match found. An old driver's license from 1972. Chicago, Illinois. Name, Elizabeth G. Wilmore. But the face? It was Eleanor. Age 20 years. The building in the photo didn't exist anymore. But it had once. Ruth had never been to Alabama. She'd only seen it through Clara's stories, soft memories of peach trees and dirt roads, girls in Sunday dresses and men who never smiled at the sky. But now, it was something else entirely. Now, it was a crime scene 70 years cold. Her flight landed in Montgomery on a humid Wednesday morning. Her press badge got her access to local records. Half the archives were digital, the other half smelled like mildew and bureaucracy. She dug through them all. The civil defense shelter in the photo had been listed under property hashtag to 28-B, part of a Cold War emergency project that was never completed. Construction stopped abruptly in 1954. Rumors swirled in the footnotes. Unexplained structural delays. Community opposition. And most telling of all, incident involving minors sealed under court order. That line stopped her breath. Sealed under court order. In 1955, 2 weeks after Eleanor vanished, Ruth found the coordinates from an old survey map. The shelter had been demolished decades ago, but the land remained overgrown, fenced off, never repurposed. She drove out there. A narrow gravel road led her through thick woods. Birds stopped singing when the engine turned off. Ruth stepped out and stared at the patch of land that had once held the building. Nothing but trees now. But when she stepped forward, her foot crunched something. Concrete. Cracked. Beneath the dirt, pieces of the old foundation still peeked through, like bones refusing to stay buried. She stood in the exact spot where the photo had been taken. And whispered. What happened here? Back in town, she visited the County Historical Society. No one remembered the shelter. But when she showed the photo, one old woman behind the desk looked up sharply. I knew her, she said. The white girl. Eleanor. You did? She used to come to my father's pharmacy. Always smiling. Always polite. Then she vanished. Just like that. Did people search for her? The woman hesitated. Whispers said her family covered it up. Didn't want a scandal. Scandal? Word was. She was in trouble. What kind of trouble? The woman looked around, then lowered her voice. Pregnant. Another pause. And not by any boy her family would approve of. Ruth felt a slow pulse behind her eyes. Do you know who? The woman didn't answer. That evening, Ruth made her way to the nursing home on the edge of town. Aunt Violet, Clara's older sister, was 90, wheelchair-bound, and half-blind. But her memory? Sharp as ever. She smiled when Ruth introduced herself. You've got Clara's eyes, she said, then added. And her curiosity. Dangerous mix. Ruth sat beside her and pulled out the photo. Violet went still. She didn't ask who it was. She didn't need to. You found it, Violet whispered. After all this time, what happened to Eleanor? She was taken, Violet said softly. By who? They called it a warning. But it was punishment. Punishment for what? For loving your grandmother. Ruth's throat closed. Did Gran love her back? She never said it. But she never loved anyone like that again either. A long silence passed between them. Then Violet leaned in, voice suddenly sharp. You be careful. This story, what they did, it wasn't just about race. Or love. It was about power. And some of the families that buried it still got plenty. Ruth nodded, overwhelmed but resolute. I need to know what they did to her. Violet closed her eyes. Then look in Clara's father's records. He was no saint, but he kept receipts. That night, Ruth broke into Clara's sealed basement storage. Beneath layers of newspapers and tax documents, she found a tightly wrapped oilskin folder. Inside, a sealed envelope, postmarked July 17, 1955. The return address, Rev. Henry Wilcox, First Missionary Church of Montgomery. The front was marked in bold red ink. Confession, do not open. Truth is like smoke. You can try to trap it, but it always finds a way out. Ruth uncovers that Clara's father helped cover up Eleanor's disappearance, not to protect the guilty, but to protect Clara herself. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Almost alive. Ruth stared at the label again. Confession, do not open. A preacher's handwriting. A preacher with Clara's family name written on the back of the envelope like a ghost. Rev. Henry Wilcox. She sat cross-legged on Clara's basement floor, fingers trembling as she peeled it open. The letter was handwritten, pages long, ink faded but legible. It was dated July 17, 1955. 2 days after Eleanor disappeared. To whomever finds this after I am gone, may God forgive me, for the world surely will not. The girl Eleanor Whitmore came to me seeking refuge. She was frightened. Said she and Clara Belle Simmons had been found out. She was bleeding when she arrived. I gave her sanctuary. I told no one. Not even her father. But I made a terrible mistake. I called someone I trusted. A deacon. To get help. To protect them both. But they came with others. I was not told they'd bring a truck. When Clara arrived that night, the men were already there. I should have stopped them. I told her to run. Ruth felt her stomach twist. They didn't hurt Clara. But they took Eleanor. I don't know where. When I confronted them, they said she was being handled. They said it was mercy. That the baby would have brought shame to everyone, white and black. And that no one would believe a girl like Clara over men like them. The next lines were smeared. Ruth wasn't sure if it was water or tears from the person who wrote it. If anyone finds this, find the girl's ribbon. It was left behind. And find the list. I wrote their names down. I kept their names. Because even if I was a coward, I would not be a liar too. Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. The Reverend Clara's own father had watched it happen. And done nothing. Or not enough. She found a second slip folded inside the envelope. A list of 5 names. All men. Most were dead now. One name was familiar, as Sheriff Chambers, whose son was running for senator that very year. She had stumbled onto something much bigger than an old family secret. She had walked into a generational machine, gears rusted in racism, class, reputation. She returned to the hospital that night, the confession tucked into a manila folder. Clara sat up when Ruth entered. Her face was pale, eyes distant. She seemed smaller than before. More fragile. I know what he did, Ruth said, not with anger, but heartbreak. Your father. I read the letter. Clara didn't respond right away. Then, finally, He didn't mean to hurt her, but he didn't stop them. Clara's voice cracked like brittle paper. He said, he couldn't protect us both. You were 15. Clara turned away. And pregnant. Ruth stared. The room went still. Even the machine seemed quiet. You were the one carrying a baby? Clara nodded, eyes full of shame or something older, heavier. They thought it was hers. Clara whispered. They blamed her. Said she corrupted me. They were going to take you too. But he told me to run. Ruth sat back in the visitor's chair, stunned. She had never imagined this. Clara had always been stern, upright, unflinching. But here was a girl inside her, a terrified, pregnant child who'd lost her best friend and nearly lost her life. Did you ever? Ruth asked. Clara shook her head. The baby didn't survive. No doctor. No help. Just my mother and a bucket of hot water. Ruth stood and pressed the envelope into Clara's hand. Gran. It's time the world knew. Clara looked down at the folded paper, then back up at her granddaughter. And what will they do with the truth, child? Will they listen? Will they care? Ruth didn't have an answer. But she would find one. Ruth returned to her motel and found a message slipped under the door. A torn scrap of newspaper with a single sentence circled in red. Missing girl likely eloped, sheriff says case closed. And below it, scribbled in shaky handwriting. Stop digging. She's not the only one we buried. He thought she was dead. Until Ruth said her name. Ruth had to fly to Charlottesville, Virginia to find him. Peter Whitmore, 82, Eleanor's older brother by 6 years, had changed his last name decades ago. He now lived quietly under the name Peter Wills, tucked in a small brick house on a sleepy suburban street where no one ever asked about the past. At first, he refused to see her. But Ruth left that photo on his doorstep with her business card. He called within an hour. His voice had the edge of someone who'd been holding a story so long it had turned into rust. Peter opened the door slowly when she arrived, his hands trembling. He was tall, still upright, but his eyes had the look of someone who'd stopped trusting people a long time ago. You said her name. He murmured. Nobody said her name to me in over half a century. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Ruth slid the photo across the table. Peter's eyes welled. She carried that damn camera everywhere. He said. Mama hated it. Said it made her think she could live like them, like her daddy's friends didn't own that land with blood. Ruth leaned forward. What happened to her, Mr. Whitmore? Peter hesitated. Then he said something Ruth didn't expect. She came to me. After. After what? Ruth asked. After she disappeared. Months later. I was at college in Atlanta. She showed up at my dorm in the middle of the night. Skinny as a stick. Hair chopped short. Said she had $20 and a new name. Did she tell you what happened? She said she was pregnant. Said it wasn't safe to come back. Said. People wanted her gone. Ruth felt her chest tighten. Did she say who the father was? Peter looked at her carefully. She never said. But she did say this. It wasn't a mistake. Peter said he gave her bus fare. Told her not to tell him where she was going. She said the less I knew, the safer I'd be. I never saw her again. You thought she died? I assumed someone caught up to her. Or the baby didn't make it. Peter's hand shook slightly as he picked up the photo again. She was always different. He said softly. Didn't fit into any of their boxes. And that town. It didn't forgive girls like her. Ruth reached into her bag and pulled out a second item, the torn newspaper clipping left at her motel. Peter read it. The color drained from his face. They're still watching, he said. After all these years. Who is? Peter leaned closer. You don't understand what kind of power covered this up. It wasn't just the sheriff. It was judges, bankers, landowners, the kind who think they're gods because they own more graves than neighbors. Ruth showed him the list from the Reverend's letter. Peter pointed to one name. That man? He whispered. He ran the group that built the shelter. Why build a shelter if you're not going to use it? Peter's face darkened. You don't build a place like that to hide from bombs. You build it to hide what you've done. Peter stood and disappeared into a back room. When he returned, he held a folded piece of photo paper. I found this in my mother's jewelry box after she passed, he said. Didn't know what to do with it. He handed it to Ruth. It was a second photograph. Same girls. Same clothes. But it had been torn in half. Eleanor was on one side. Clara was barely visible on the edge, like someone had tried to erase her completely. But behind them, clearly visible, was a strange mark carved into the shelter wall. Not graffiti. A symbol, the same one on the back of the first photo. When silence rots long enough, it stinks. Clara hadn't spoken all morning. She sat in her hospital bed, hands folded neatly in her lap like a child in Sunday service. Her eyes stayed fixed on the window, watching nothing, just holding the past like it might run away again if she blinked. Ruth sat beside her with the second photograph in hand, the one Peter had given her. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she placed the photo on Clara's lap carefully, like she was setting down something sacred. Clara didn't touch it, but her body changed, a slight stiffening in the shoulders, a tremor in the chin. It was supposed to be one photo, she whispered. Just one? To prove it happened. Ruth stayed silent. Clara reached for the edge of the blanket and twisted it in her fist. But then we laughed too loud. And we kissed too long. And somebody saw. Ruth watched her carefully. Was it your father? No. Worse. A boy from church. Wanted to court me. I didn't want him. Clara gave a bitter chuckle. He said I'd gone funny. Said I was corrupted. Said he'd tell someone. And then he did. Who? Clara looked up at Ruth, eyes glassy. The sheriff. The room went still. Clara finally picked up the photo and stared at the torn edge. Her fingers ran along the missing half like she could still feel Eleanor there. They didn't take her to jail, Clara said. They didn't even ask questions. They just took her. Ruth's throat felt like it was closing. Did you see it happen? Clara's lips trembled. I heard her scream. I was hiding behind the trees. I was supposed to meet her at the shelter that night. We were going to leave. She had money, tickets, a plan. What happened? They got there first. Clara's breathing quickened. Her hand went to her chest, heart monitor spiking. A nurse peeked in, but Ruth gently waved her off. She screamed my name. Clara whispered. She screamed my name. Her eyes were far away now, not in Brooklyn, not in a hospital bed, but back in the Alabama woods in the sticky summer of 1955. Hiding in terror. Paralyzed. She begged me to help her. And I ran. You were 15. I ran. Clara said again, voice cracking. I left her. Ruth reached out and took her hand. You survived, she said softly. That's not weakness. That's what they didn't want you to do. Clara squeezed her hand back barely. Tears rolled down her face, slow and soundless. She could have made it, Clara whispered. She was smart, brave. She would have gone to college, been a teacher, had babies. grown old. And now, she said, finally looking Ruth in the eye, all that's left of her is in this photo. They sat in silence for a while. Ruth didn't press. She didn't ask for more. Eventually, Clara said, "You want to tell the story, don't you? I think the world needs to know." Clara nodded once. "Then you need to find the shelter's floor plans." Ruth blinked. "Why?" "Because there was a basement." Ruth returned to the archives that evening. She requested every document tied to property hashtag to 28-B. One of the blueprints she'd never noticed before had a second layer slightly faded behind the first. A trapdoor marked beneath the west wall. Next to it, scrawled in tiny handwriting, "Root cellar repurposed. Sealed July 17, 1955. The past doesn't rest. Especially not where it was hidden." The blueprint stayed burned in Ruth's mind like a secret she hadn't asked permission to know. A root cellar. Sealed in 1955. Under a building that no longer existed, but once used to hide people. Or bury them. She made 2 calls, one to a historical preservationist she knew in Atlanta, the other to a forensic archaeologist she'd worked with on a past story involving slave graves discovered beneath a high school. Old root cellars usually sit beneath soft earth, the archaeologist said. If it was sealed hastily, it may have collapsed. But if there's something down there, we'll find it. 2 days later, Ruth stood with a small team just outside Montgomery on the overgrown site of the former civil defense shelter. Permission had taken fast talking and some clever paperwork, but her credentials as a journalist opened the gate. They scanned the ground with radar. At first nothing. Then, a cavity. Roughly 10 by 12 feet. Perfectly rectangular. No pipes, no plumbing. Just air where there shouldn't be air. And nearby, barely 5 feet from the edge of the cavity, the radar pinged again. This time, denser material. Bone? Wood? Both? They dug. 6 feet down, beneath tangled roots and crushed clay, they hit the top of what had once been a wooden platform, now rotted, caved in. It took 3 hours to uncover it without destroying what lay below. Inside was a small wooden cross, splintered but clearly handmade. Wrapped around it, a red ribbon, weather-worn and faded to rust. Ruth stared at it, stunned. One of the men handed her a mask and gloves. They continued the excavation slowly. At the very bottom, they found a child's blanket, rotted through, and what appeared to be part of a baby's rattle. But no body. Just absence. As if someone had already come and taken something away. Ruth returned to the courthouse demanding access to 1955 coroner records. They claimed they'd been lost in a fire. She didn't believe them. She visited the local church cemetery Eleanor's family once attended. Most of the gravestones were tall, marble, and stately. But behind the chapel, near the fence line, was a row of unmarked graves. 6 of them. Spaced exactly 5 feet apart. No dates. No names. Just simple crosses hammered into the dirt. She asked the groundskeeper who was buried there. He shrugged. Just folks the town didn't want remembered. Ruth called the lab and asked for testing on the ribbon and the cross. But as she hung up, her phone buzzed again. A voice altered, mechanical. "You need to stop." Ruth froze. "You're about to turn memories into evidence. That's when people start dying." The line went dead. She drove straight to Clara. The ribbon in her hand. Clara stared at it like it was a ghost. "That's hers," she said. "That was in her hair the night they took her. Gran. What was in that cellar?" Clara's lips parted, but no sound came out. Then, "I don't know. But you think?" Clara nodded once. "She was bleeding. They wouldn't let her go to a hospital. I think." Her hand trembled. I think they didn't want a baby born that could prove what happened. Ruth's DNA contact called that night. You're not gonna believe this. The woman said. The hair from Eleanor's brush, it's a match. A match with what? The woman hesitated. With a woman who was adopted in 1956. A closed file. Name changed. Ruth's voice dropped to a whisper. Eleanor's daughter? Alive. Living in Chicago. Wants to talk. The past doesn't rest. Especially not where it was hidden. The blueprint stayed burned in Ruth's mind like a secret she hadn't asked permission to know. A root cellar. Sealed in 1955. Under a building that no longer existed. But once used to hide people. Or bury them. She made 2 calls, one to a historical preservationist she knew in Atlanta, the other to a forensic archaeologist she'd worked with on a past story involving slave graves discovered beneath a high school. Old root cellars usually sit beneath soft earth. The archaeologist said. If it was sealed hastily, it may have collapsed. But if there's something down there, we'll find it. 2 days later, Ruth stood with a small team just outside Montgomery on the overgrown site of the former civil defense shelter. Permission had taken fast talking and some clever paperwork, but her credentials as a journalist opened the gate. They scanned the ground with radar. At first nothing. Then, a cavity. Roughly 10 by 12 feet. Perfectly rectangular. No pipes, no plumbing. Just air where there shouldn't be air. And nearby, barely 5 feet from the edge of the cavity, the radar pinged again. This time, denser material. Bone? Wood? Both? They dug. 6 feet down, beneath tangled roots and crushed clay, they hit the top of what had once been a wooden platform, now rotted, caved in. It took 3 hours to uncover it without destroying what lay below. Inside was a small wooden cross, splintered but clearly handmade. Wrapped around it, a red ribbon, weather-worn and faded to rust. Ruth stared at it, stunned. One of the men handed her a mask and gloves. They continued the excavation slowly. At the very bottom, they found a child's blanket, rotted through, and what appeared to be part of a baby's rattle. But no body. Just absence. As if someone had already come and taken something away. Ruth returned to the courthouse demanding access to 1955 coroner records. They claimed they'd been lost in a fire. She didn't believe them. She visited the local church cemetery Eleanor's family once attended. Most of the gravestones were tall, marble, and stately. But behind the chapel, near the fence line, was a row of unmarked graves. 6 of them. Spaced exactly 5 feet apart. No dates. No names. Just simple crosses hammered into the dirt. She asked the groundskeeper who was buried there. He shrugged. Just folks the town didn't want remembered. Ruth called the lab and asked for testing on the ribbon and the cross. But as she hung up, her phone buzzed again. A voice altered, mechanical. You need to stop. Ruth froze. You're about to turn memories into evidence. That's when people start dying. The line went dead. She drove straight to Clara. The ribbon in her hand. Clara stared at it like it was a ghost. That's hers, she said. That was in her hair the night they took her. Gran. What was in that cellar? Clara's lips parted, but no sound came out. Then? I don't know. But you think? Clara nodded once. She was bleeding. They wouldn't let her go to a hospital. I think. Her hand trembled. I think they didn't want a baby born that could prove what happened. Ruth's DNA contact called that night. You're not gonna believe this. The woman said. The hair from Eleanor's brush, it's a match. A match with what? The woman hesitated. With a woman who was adopted in 1956. A closed file. Name changed. Ruth's voice dropped to a whisper. Eleanor's daughter? Alive. Living in Chicago. Wants to talk. 70 years. And no one had opened it. Eleanor survived, escaped Alabama, gave birth, and tried to send a message to her child who is now alive and waiting. Chicago. Union Station. The past had waited quietly, buried behind numbered lockers and the hum of trains. Ruth stood in a dim archive room beneath the city, a place that smelled like rust and paperwork. The station officer handed her a plastic container, its seal still intact. A yellowed tag dangled from the handle. Locker 77, abandoned July 1955. Inside was a faded velvet pouch. The letters were brittle but intact, each sealed with wax. The handwriting matched Eleanor's loopy, determined, adolescent, but clear. One was addressed to Clara Bell Simmons, do not open if found by anyone else. Another simply said, For my daughter. If you are reading this, I made it. Ruth sat on the floor of the archive, hands shaking as she opened the first letter. Clara, I'm writing this from a women's shelter in St. Louis. I made it through Alabama. Barely. They followed me halfway up the river. I had to cut my hair, wear a boy's coat, lie with every breath. But I made it. And I'm still carrying her. Ruth's eyes widened. Her? Not just a child, a daughter. I don't know if I'll live long enough to see her face. But if I do, I'll name her something strong. Something they can't erase. And if I don't, maybe this letter will be enough for her to know she was made in love. In terror. In defiance. But never in shame. Please tell her that. If you're reading this, tell her I wanted her. Tell her I gave everything so she could exist. Ruth wiped her eyes. The envelope marked for my daughter was smaller. A photo was tucked inside of Eleanor, holding a newborn in her arms, hair buzzed short, smile crooked but real. On the back, written in barely their ink. Born February 2, 1956, Deborah. Deborah. Ruth already had the contact from the DNA match. She dialed. Later that evening, they met in a quiet cafe near the lakeshore. Deborah Carter, 69, elegant in posture but weary-eyed, sat across from Ruth like someone holding two lives in one body, the one she lived and the one she never knew. You're sure? She asked. Ruth nodded. The DNA match confirms it. You're Eleanor's daughter. Deborah let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding for decades. I always knew I didn't come from the story they told me, she said. There were gaps. My adoptive parents were kind, but never open. When I asked about my birth mother, they said she died. That she left no note. She left everything. Ruth said, sliding the letters across the table. They just never let you see it. Deborah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Her breath hitched as she read Eleanor's handwriting. I look like her, she whispered. People always said that. She risked everything to give you a life. Ruth handed her the photo. Deborah stared at it for a long time, her thumb running across Eleanor's face like she could feel the memory through the ink. She looks so young. She was. Where's Clara? Deborah asked. In New York. She's still alive. Deborah's eyes welled. She knew my mother? She loved her. Then I need to meet her. That night, Ruth received a call from the DNA lab. There's more, the voice said. Deborah's match didn't just ping with Eleanor. What do you mean? She shares a second-degree match with you. Ruth froze. Second degree? The voice on the phone hesitated. Meaning you and Deborah share a grandparent. The system erased her name. But not her blood. Ruth didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling of her Chicago motel, the air thick with questions that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. She was supposed to be the storyteller, the observer, the one asking questions, not becoming one. But now the data said otherwise. Deborah Carter, Eleanor's daughter, shared second-degree DNA with her, which meant one of Ruth's grandparents was also Deborah's. And Clara was the only grandparent Ruth had left. Back in New York, Clara lay in bed, a thin oxygen line under her nose. Ruth sat beside her with a laptop open and the results on screen. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." Clara didn't blink. "Ask. Did you ever have a child? Before Mom?" Clara's eyes flickered. "No. I had one child. Elaine. And before Elaine?" Clara went quiet. Ruth turned the laptop toward her. "DNA says Deborah and I are family." Clara looked down at her hands. Old, veined, gripping the sheet like it was an anchor. Then she whispered, "I lost the baby. That's what I was told to say. What I believed. Gran. They took her." Clara's voice broke. "I was 15. No hospital. Just pain. Bleeding. My mother and a midwife from across town. I passed out. When I woke up, there was no baby." Ruth sat stunned. "They told you she died? They told me to forget." She looked at Ruth, tears streaming down her face. "But I felt her. Before I passed out. I felt her move. I felt her cry. And then nothing." Ruth showed her the photo. Eleanor holding the baby. Clara choked on a sob. "They let her live," she whispered. "They let her live. But not with me." Ruth placed her hand over hers. "She's alive. And she wants to meet you." Chicago. 2 days later. Clara sat across from Deborah in a quiet garden cafe, a silk scarf tied neatly around her neck, hands trembling. Deborah reached across the table first. Took her hand. Said nothing. Clara stared at her for a long moment, then said, "You have her eyes." Deborah nodded. "They told me my mother was a mistake. That I was lucky anyone took me. You were never a mistake." Clara said, voice firm despite the tremble. "You were made of love. Maybe not the world's kind, but mine." Deborah smiled through tears. "I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to hear that." They sat for hours. No reporters. No cameras. Just time. Ruth watched from a distance. For once, she didn't need to ask anything. She just listened. As Clara rose to leave, Deborah said, "There's something else. A man. I met him when I was 20. Said he knew my mother. Said he had her journals. What was his name?" Ruth asked. Deborah shook her head. "He never gave it. But he had a scar. Right across his neck. Like someone tried to silence him." Clara froze. "I know that scar," she whispered. She looked like Eleanor. She looked like Clara. She looked like the past coming home. New York, 2025. The photo sat between them on the table. The same one from 70 years ago, now digitized, enlarged, printed, framed. Eleanor. Clara. Laughing in the sun. Across from Clara sat Deborah, her back straight, fingers twisting a napkin with the same nervous energy Eleanor once had. And beside Deborah sat Ruth, the bridge between the two. 3 women tied by blood and grief, now stitched together by truth. "I can't stop staring at it," Deborah said. "I've had pictures of my adoptive family my whole life. But this one, it feels like home." Clara nodded slowly. "That day was the last time I remember feeling free. Ruth gently placed a stack of letters in front of them, Eleanor's hidden notes, her escape plans, her dream of teaching in Chicago, of raising a daughter far from the shame the world tried to wrap around her. Deborah traced the edges of one letter with her finger. She tried so hard. She made it. Clara whispered. She got you here. That's more than most of us could say. Later, they walked through the park, 3 generations side by side, their steps uncertain but unified. Clara shared stories Eleanor had once told her about books and dreams and what kind of women they wanted to be. Ruth added fragments of her own research timelines, names, cover-ups. Deborah filled in the strange, fractured memories from her childhood, the older woman who once visited her orphanage with tears in her eyes but never came back. I think it was her, she said. I think my mother saw me once. Then Ruth pulled up a photo on her phone, a black and white police file from 1961. A man with a scar across his neck. Deborah gasped. That's him. Ruth nodded. Name's Michael Beale. Former deacon. Disappeared in the 70s after a corruption case in Montgomery. But before he vanished, he was questioned in a trafficking case. Never charged. Was he one of the men who took Eleanor? Deborah asked. We don't know. But he was the last one who claimed to see her alive. Clara stared at the screen. Her hands shook slightly. He used to come to our church. Carried a Bible like a badge. You think he's still alive? Ruth asked. Clara didn't answer. Ruth leaned forward. Because someone's been leaving messages. Notes. The threat at the motel. The torn newspaper. Clara looked up slowly. If he is alive, she said, voice hardening. Then he still thinks he owns the truth. The next morning, a package arrived at Ruth's apartment. Inside, a cassette tape with a sticky note. 3 words in shaky handwriting. She didn't die. She looked like Eleanor. She looked like Clara. She looked like the past coming home. New York, 2025. The photo sat between them on the table. The same one from 70 years ago, now digitized, enlarged, printed, framed. Eleanor. Clara. Laughing in the sun. Across from Clara sat Deborah, her back straight, fingers twisting a napkin with the same nervous energy Eleanor once had. And beside Deborah sat Ruth, the bridge between the two. 3 women tied by blood and grief, now stitched together by truth. I can't stop staring at it, Deborah said. I've had pictures of my adoptive family my whole life. But this one, it feels like home. Clara nodded slowly. That day was the last time I remember feeling free. Ruth gently placed a stack of letters in front of them, Eleanor's hidden notes, her escape plans, her dream of teaching in Chicago, of raising a daughter far from the shame the world tried to wrap around her. Deborah traced the edges of one letter with her finger. She tried so hard. She made it. Clara whispered. She got you here. That's more than most of us could say. Later, they walked through the park, 3 generations side by side, their steps uncertain but unified. Clara shared stories Eleanor had once told her about books and dreams and what kind of women they wanted to be. Ruth added fragments of her own research timelines, names, cover-ups. Deborah filled in the strange, fractured memories from her childhood, the older woman who once visited her orphanage with tears in her eyes but never came back. I think it was her, she said. I think my mother saw me once. Then Ruth pulled up a photo on her phone, a black and white police file from 1961. A man with a scar across his neck. Deborah gasped. That's him. Ruth nodded. Name's Michael Beale. Former deacon. Disappeared in the 70s after a corruption case in Montgomery. But before he vanished, he was questioned in a trafficking case. Never charged. Was he one of the men who took Eleanor? Deborah asked. We don't know. But he was the last one who claimed to see her alive. Clara stared at the screen. Her hands shook slightly. He used to come to our church. Carried a Bible like a badge. You think he's still alive? Ruth asked. Clara didn't answer. Ruth leaned forward. Because someone's been leaving messages. Notes. The threat at the motel. The torn newspaper. Clara looked up slowly. If he is alive, she said, voice hardening, then he still thinks he owns the truth. The next morning, a package arrived at Ruth's apartment. Inside, a cassette tape with a sticky note. 3 words in shaky handwriting. She didn't die. The town wanted to forget. Ruth wanted the world to remember. The article went live at 7:04 am. Title: Buried Under Alabama, the photo, the girl, and the silence that lasted 70 years. By Ruth Simmons. Published by The Atlantic. Backed by verified DNA, archival evidence, and decades of sealed secrets. Within hours, the story exploded. Cable news picked it up. Hashtags trended. People who had never heard of Eleanor Whitmore or Clara Belle Simmons were suddenly demanding justice for both. Clara watched from her living room in New York, wrapped in her shawl, tears slipping silently down her face. Deborah sat beside her, holding her hand. It's her, Clara whispered. She's everywhere now. They couldn't erase her. In Montgomery, the backlash was immediate. Old men who once held office were named in the article. Their children now sat in those offices. Phones rang. Protests formed outside City Hall. Civil rights attorneys called for action. But the local police chief, a black woman, born long after the crimes, responded swiftly. We're opening a cold case investigation into the disappearance of Eleanor Grace Whitmore. A press conference followed. Questions fired. A mural appeared the next day near the church wall. Eleanor and Clara, hand in hand. Painted in color. Ruth didn't rest. She submitted the ledger to state archives. Contacted descendants of the other names. Filed for the release of sealed adoption records including Deborah's. And reached out to every journalist, podcaster, and documentary producer she knew. This wasn't just one story. It was an entire pattern, hidden for generations. But then came the threat. Ruth's editor forwarded an anonymous message, a scanned note. You've made enough noise. Time to go quiet. Attached, a photo of Clara's house. Taken that morning. Ruth flew home that night. Found Clara calm. Unshaken. They're scared. Clara said. Means you did it right. They threatened you. They already did that. Long ago. And I'm still here. Later, Ruth sat alone in her apartment, sifting through the final box of Eleanor's things. Letters. Scraps. Notes. Then she noticed something odd: the original photo. The one she found in the book. The paper had separated slightly at the edge. She peeled it back carefully. And discovered a second photo tucked behind it. Same 2 girls. Same dresses. Same day. But this time they were holding a baby blanket. Written in faint ink on the back. This is where the story really begins. It wasn't just a photo. It was proof that they loved, they lived, they mattered. They stood at the edge of the Memorial Garden, just outside Montgomery. A new plaque had been installed. Beneath a young oak tree, soft leaves rustling like whispers. Eleanor Grace Whitmore. Born 1940, disappeared 1955. Mother. Daughter. Survivor. Witness. The truth outlives silence. Clara placed the photograph, now fully restored, inside a weatherproof frame beside the plaque. Eleanor's laughter stared back at them. She and Clara. Their fingers laced. A blur of wind in their skirts. A dream almost lived. Ruth stood beside her. And Deborah stood on Clara's other side, one hand resting on her mother's shoulder. Say her name. Clara whispered. Eleanor. Deborah said softly. Ruth repeated it. The wind carried it through the trees. Later that day, Ruth uploaded the last page of her article and epilogue. She held on to this photo for 70 years. But it wasn't the image she was protecting, it was the truth behind it. The truth they tried to erase, because it made them uncomfortable, or guilty, or afraid. But silence has an expiration date. And so does power. The women in this story weren't just survivors. They were archivists of love. And love leaves evidence. Clara passed peacefully 3 months later, in her sleep. Her last request was simple: bury me with the book. And the photo. Let me hold her again. 1 year later, Ruth stood in front of a packed auditorium at the National Civil Rights Museum, accepting a Peabody Award. She wore a simple black dress and a red ribbon around her wrist. My grandmother taught me that grief isn't weakness. It's evidence of love, she said. So we honor the grief and we keep digging. A young girl at the museum stops in front of the photo exhibit. She stares at the image of Eleanor and Clara. She turns to her mother and asks, "Were they friends?" Her mother smiles. "No, baby. They were more than that."